Everyone, thank you for joining my talk. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm sharing my talk from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay respect to the elders past, present, and emergent. I'm very excited to share with you our findings from a study where we evaluate the changing patterns in how systematic review is being reported and how data is being shared. Special thanks to my supervisors and my colleagues at the Methods and Evidence Synthesis Unit who have generously supported this project. So this is a series of studies as part of the REPRISE project, which aim to evaluate the reproducibility and replicability of systematic reviews. This will be the first study in the series where we will evaluate the completeness of reporting and sharing of review materials in a cross-sectional sample of systematic review. So my fellow systematic reviewers would agree with me that the road to evidence synthesis is always paved with multiple judgment calls and decisions from the time you're conducting your database search, your selected studies, doing your data collection, doing your risk of bias assessment, to the point you are designing your statistical methods of your meta-analysis. All these are important informations that readers want to know when they are assessing the validity of systematic review. And with that in mind, it is very important that systematic reviewers report these details as completely as possible to eliminate any uncertainty. It will assist future systematic reviewers who are interested in replicating or reproducing such systematic review. It will also assist the general reader in interpreting, validating, or generally applying the findings of the review to the particular context. And overall, it will promote open science in evidence-based medicine. And with that in mind, a lot of reporting guidelines have been developed over the years as a guide for systematic reviewers when they are writing the report of their systematic review. So we are coming into this picture with two particular questions that we want to answer. Firstly, whether the practice of the reporting the review, as well as sharing data of the review improved in the last 6 years, and whether the increased adoption of the reporting guidelines had any role to play in these changes. So we selected a sample of 300 random systematic review from 6 databases that were indexed in late 2020, underwent your double screening with 2 independent authors. And so our study covered a wide range of health topics, different types of interventions. We try to aim to make it as representative of the current literature of systematic reviews as much as possible. So in data collections, we are aiming to collect as much details about the reviews as possible. So we recorded whether the authors reported their funding source, their COI, whether they cited a protocol or reservation record, whether they stated their PICOS eligibility, whether they include all these information about the search strategy that will enable a faithful replication of such search. We also recorded whether they include details about the other processes of the review, as well as the statistical methods that were adopted for the meta-analysis. And last but not least, we also recorded whether the author shared the data underlying the meta-analysis. So to answer the first question, has the practice of reporting methods as well as sharing the data code improved in the last 6 years? The answer is, as you've seen, yes and no. When we're looking at this answer, we are comparing, we took a subsample of our 2020 systematic reviews with only health interventions and excluding Cochrane review, and we compare it with a sample that were indexed in 2014, a comparative sample. And we found that systematic reviews in 2020 were more likely to report that they use a reporting guideline. They were more likely to report using their funding source, whether they have a protocol, the date limits they use for search, separate search strategy for all the databases that they reported searching. And lastly, the data preparation methods. So calculations of missing data or calculation of the effect estimates used in the meta-analysis, for example. However, as you have seen from the remaining items from our data extraction form, we didn't see any conclusive improvement over time. And especially there was no improvement as well in terms of the frequency of sharing data or code underlying the meta-analysis. As for the second question, did the increased use of reporting guidelines have any role to play in these patterns, changing patterns that we have seen? Answers again, yes and no. So for this question, we are looking only at the sample in 2020. So we're comparing systematic reviews that make a reference to a reporting guideline in their manuscript versus those that didn't. And we found that studies, reviews that are referencing a reporting guidelines tend to report more frequently their protocols, tend to report which interfaces they use to search the database, their date of the last search, again, different search strategy for separate databases, as well as other informations, including tilesware estimator that we used. And more importantly, they tend to share the data and materials more frequently. However, as you have seen from this graph, the results are statistically not conclusive on these, the performance of these systematic reviews. So in summary, between 2014 and 2020, we observed some improvement in the practices of reporting systematic reviews. However, the frequency of sharing data, analytic code underlying the meta-analysis remained rare. We also observed that citing a reporting guideline in the review report is becoming a more common practice. However, we see that such self-reported use of a reporting guideline, it might play a role in encouraging some of the good practices in reporting systematic review, but it didn't account for all these changes or improvement that we have observed over time. So there would be other factors underlying these changing or discouraging the complete reporting of systematic reviews, which we will explore in our subsequent studies of the REPRISE project. So thank you for your attention and welcome any questions.
And ask them directly. We've got 29 people in the room, so I'm sure there will be some questions.
Can I ask a question, Angela? It's Sue.
Sure, Sue, go ahead.
Phoebe, you mentioned that there are other factors that are likely to be influencing the quality of reporting. Do you have some idea about what those might be?
Yes, so actually we wrestled with this question throughout our study actually. The short answer is we don't know with certainty from our study. The long answer is, yeah, we set out to investigate only the role that reporting guidelines in this, so we only did the statistical analysis on reporting guidelines. However, from the descriptive statistics, we have identified some potential factors that might have influenced these changes, like encourage more complete reporting. So for example, the increasing use of the Prisma flowchart have encouraged authors actually more frequently report the number of searches that they retrieved from each database. The rising popularity of other software besides Refmont, like R and Stata, also play a role because they provide different options for the meta-analysis methods, and they also provide they also present the statistical methods details on the forest plot differently, and that will also influence how often the information are being presented. But most importantly, we actually investigate whether there's one very important factor, which is the journal data sharing policy. We've actually recorded whether the publishing journal of these reviews had a policy that requires author to share the data, or at least have a data availability statement as a condition for publication. And short story, they did make a positive influence in encouraging more sharing of data over time. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, the other comment that I would have is it's quite a short time frame, really, isn't it, for change? And you know, when you think about healthcare interventions or other things, we know that the diffusion of new new innovations can take can be different and can take a different amount of time in different circumstances. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on whether you might expect some of these things to be diffused more quickly than others, whereas your presumption under this is that everything would change at the same rate and over the same time. And with a kind of a 2-by-2 comparison, you may not capture some of that useful information.
Yeah, indeed, that's one thing we have actually observed from our statistics, that actually different informations about the review process are affected by different types of influences. So there was a certain, so there are two general categories. One that's more related to the technical challenges, the use of the software, the understanding of the statistical methods. These I would expect with, a little bit of push in training and more educations by the different organizations like Cochrane or JPI, we would be able to, I think, very quickly bring the new reviewers up to par, know what they need to share about their statistical methods. So that would be quite quickly, I think. And the more harder factors that I think would take time to change is the influencing of the motivation barriers for reviewers to share more detailed their data files underlying their meta-analysis, which is actually a very interesting point, because my colleague Matt will kind of explore this area about what they think. Good. Yeah, about this this issue. Yeah, he will touch on that. So yeah, motivation will take a bit.
Thank you.
To impact. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. I've been a bad chair because I'm encouraging conversation beyond your time. But thank you very much for that, and that's a very great segue into Matthew's talk. So thanks, Phoebe, and I'd like to introduce Matthew Page, who on behalf of his review group will present data availability statements and systematic reviews of interventions, a content analysis. So just a reminder to everybody else, please mute while Matt talks. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. And thanks everyone for attending. First, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land from which I'm speaking, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So this piece of work is a follow-up to the study that Phoebe just presented. So as probably several of you have come across this notion that sharing data files, analytic code, and other materials that underlie a research project has many benefits. It allows people to reuse your data to answer questions that might not have been addressed in the original study, or to check for any errors that might need to be corrected. And as a way to try and promote the sharing of data and code, journals are increasingly asking people to include a data or code availability statement in their manuscript, which indicates whether the data and code used in a study are available, and if so, where it can be accessed. And it was unclear to us how often such data and code availability statements appear in systematic reviews, and how review authors interpret what they should include in such statements. So the objective of this study was to estimate the frequency of data and code availability statements in a random sample of systematic reviews of interventions, and to summarize the content of these statements. So we used the same sample that Phoebe introduced us to in her first presentation. So we're looking at a sample of 300 systematic reviews, all of which had to have had a meta-analysis that was evaluating the effects of a health, social, behavioural, or educational intervention, and which was indexed during a 4-week period in late 2020. And we extracted any data and code availability statements that appeared within these review manuscripts verbatim. We then used an inductive coding approach to analyse what these statements were saying. And so one author, myself, read through each data and code availability statement and derived a relevant code to summarize the meaning of that statement. And these codes would be updated iteratively based on evaluating each statement one by one. Then we had another author in Phoebe classifying each statement independently using the codes that I had populated, or deriving another code that she felt was more relevant. And then we resolved any discrepancies via discussion. So first off, how often do these statements appear in reviews? So in our sample of 300 reviews, only 29% included only a data availability statement. None had just a code availability statement, and 2% had both a data and a code availability statement. And so what sort of things did people write in these statements? Well, we found that in 13%, the review authors, so this is across the 93 data availability statements we analysed, 13% of them indicated that the data underlying meta-analyses was publicly available and provided a link to that data set. 42% just said that data were available upon request. And then around 40% collectively essentially implied that data sharing is not applicable to systematic reviews. And there are a couple of reasons why they suggested that. And I thought I'll just give you some examples of what these statements look like. And so some people claim data sharing is not applicable as the data are secondary data drawn from already published literature. Others stated the studies were available online. And then others stated this paper is a review and the data are from published literature. It is valid. It might be valid the methods that they actually use, but that's not entirely relevant to this issue of whether they're making their information available and why they should make it available. About 10% said no data were used to support this study, which is quite bizarre given that every single review had done a meta-analysis. And even if they hadn't done a meta-analysis, if you're including at least one study, you are using some data to support your conclusions. There were some conflicting statements whereby some people would say data sharing is not applicable to this article as no data sets were generated or analysed during the study, but the data sets generated during or analysed are available from the corresponding author, which suggests people might be a bit confused and not really thinking about whether they're making their data available or not. And then about 23% said that all data used in this study are included in this article. And I'm interpreting that as implying that they've presented their data on a table or a forest plot and that's enough. But it's not unusual to come across reviews that published in journals which have forest plots looking like this, which my colleague Simon Turner, who we're presenting next, had pointed out that it's really quite difficult to interpret such a forest plot and in making use of the information when everything's so blurry. So in Prisma 2020, the final item in the statement now recommends people include a data and code availability statement in their review. And we point out that sharing an editable file, such as a CSV file or a RevMan file containing the data included in meta-analyses facilitates reuse. It's much easier to reuse that data in, say, an overview of reviews or a guideline or in a replication or update of a review than expecting people to manually extract that information. And if you've used software for which you had to write code, such as R or Stata, sharing it allows others to understand more about your analysis than what you can provide in text. So in summary, data and code availability statements currently appear infrequently in review manuscripts. And those that do provide them often incorrectly imply that data sharing is not applicable to systematic reviews, which I find somewhat ironic given that review authors have for a long time been calling for greater transparency in primary studies. And I think we should be holding ourselves to the same standard. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We'll take some questions from the floor. I've got one to start off with. And some of I've always shared all the data from my systematic reviews. It does represent quite a lot of time and effort because often there's a lot of data manipulation and recalculation that goes into assembling large data sets. And I was burnt one time by making it available, and I discovered that some other people had taken the data set and done a network meta-analysis, which was actually on my game plan too, but they hadn't let us know or involved us. And so they'd taken quite a lot of our work and represented it as their own. And I wonder if that's behind some people's lack of that lack of generosity in the secondary reuse of involving the people who'd established the data in the first place. Maybe that's behind some people's reticence in sharing. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
I think that's definitely, I've heard other people express the same concern. And what we're currently doing at the moment is we're doing a survey of authors of reviews to gauge their views on whether they think we should be sharing review data, and if not, why not, and any concerns they have. So if anyone in the room was sent that survey, please complete it. And we'll get a bit more information about what sort of reasons people provide for not doing this routinely.
Yeah. Well, I certainly changed my practice to now making it available on request, because I want to know who's accessing it and what they're going to use it for. Only to, it doesn't mean I won't share it, but I've been more cautious. And I just noticed that Lene in the chat has asked, what do you think needs to happen to increase data sharing in systematic reviews beyond the PRISMA statement?
I think it needs to be a bit clearer in the journals that I think the journal data sharing policies, we did have a look at them to see if they were explicitly recommending against sharing of review data, but I think we didn't find any evidence of that. But I think having a bit more education for review authors of what they can share and should share would be useful. And I guess more direct links to where people can deposit such information coming from the journal websites would possibly be a good start, other than just using PRISMA.
Yeah. And probably has to be cost neutral, doesn't it? I noticed, increasingly we have to pay to publish anything, even when it's apparently not a for payment journal. But having to pay to archive your data as well is another thing that most reviews aren't funded for. I've noticed another chat in the chat from Kylie saying, great talk, Matt. For studies that said their data were available, did you check whether it could be retrieved and or its quality?
We're currently doing that right now. So Phoebe has emailed all those authors just last week, and we're waiting for responses.
Great, thank you so much. Well, that was a great talk. We'll better move swiftly on to the next one. So we've got Simon Turner, who's going to present using digital data extraction to facilitate meta-analysis of interrupted time series studies. Take it away, please, Simon.
I am, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank my two colleagues for staying to time so that I can take a bit longer if I need to and not get too much slam for it. Just joking. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Simon Turner. I work also with Matt and Phoebe at Monash University in the Methods in Evidence Synthesis unit. Today I'm going to talk about using digital data extraction to facilitate the meta-analysis of interrupted time series studies. And I'm going to crack right into it. When it's not really possible to run a randomized controlled trial in the Cochrane Library, we like to recommend that interrupted time series studies can be used when it's possible, when we've got this data collected over time, to investigate the impact of public health interventions. We can do that by using the data that we have beforehand and predicting a counterfactual, what might have happened if there'd been no intervention. And then we can compare it to what we actually observe. Now, there's lots of different ways we can compare it. And Elizabeth Korovar mentioned some of those just on Tuesday. She also spoke about meta-analysis of interrupted time series studies and pointed out that often we have to reanalyze the data. Now, there's many reasons that might be the case. For example, we might want to get a report estimate that's been not included in the original study. We might be interested in meta-analyzing 12 months post-intervention or a slope change when the slope change wasn't actually given in the first place. We, of course, will want an estimate of precision, and they're sometimes not given either. And more importantly, we might want to use an appropriate and consistent statistical method when we're looking at the different interrupted time series. Now, that would be great if we had access to original data, which segues very nicely into what Matt was just talking about, but we know that often that's quite hard to come across. Fortunately, with interrupted time series studies, there's almost always a graph included. We looked at 200 public health impact related interrupted time series and found that over 90% of them did include a graph. Now, what that means is we can use digital data extraction. Now, if you're not familiar with digital data extraction, it's quite straightforward nowadays. There's lots of software available. Essentially, you upload your nice looking graph, and then you, first step, tell the computer where the X and Y axis are. You literally just click on the screen. The computer stores where those pixels are. You then tell the computer what those represent. So here we'd be typing in 1st of January 2018, 1st of January 2020 for our X, and 30 and 70 for our Y. From then, all you have to do, I say as if it's very straightforward, is just click on the points. Now that's great for a small data set. It's a bit more time consuming. for a long data set, but the computer can then scale the position on the screen with the values that we've entered from the labels and the tick marks. Now, another unfortunately, those three criteria were only jointly met in about a third of the graphs that we found in the review. More often with time series data, we get line graphs. Now, the tricks for data extracting on a line graph is that some of the points are quite straightforward to see, where we've got these nice sharp bits, but in straight sections, it can actually be a bit more difficult to work out where the data point is. Some software, such as Excel, doesn't plot in such a way that the points match up exactly with the tick marks. So that adds a bit of a complication. So the aim of this study was to analyze and compare level change and slope change estimates from digitally extracted data to original data. Now, we were quite fortunate in that we requested a lot of data and received it. We had 43 interrupted time series graphs for which we were able to also receive the original data. We had 4 data extractors and we used WebPlot Digitizer. It's a free online and software that you can also get offline, and there have been studies that have shown that it gives valid results for scatter plots. Now, we were less interested in how accurately individual points could be extracted, and we're quite keen to know how that would affect our level change and slope change estimates. So in the interest of time, I've just put together a couple of graphs to sort of show what the data looks like after we've extracted it. And we had lots of studies dealing with hospital level interventions to countrywide interventions. So we've rescaled the data so that the original data fits nice and neatly with a point estimate of 0 and a confidence interval width of 1 from -0.5 to 0.5. And then we can compare using the same scaling factors the extracted data. And what we're hopefully looking for, if the extractor has extracted the data exactly perfectly, this little white square representing the point estimate will be at 0, and the black line representing the confidence interval will be exactly the same as the original and go from -0.5 to 0.5. So when we look at our 4 data extractors and our 43 data sets and have a look at them all together, we can see that all of these little white squares, which we want to line up exactly along 0, do line up very nicely, very close to 0. Every now and then there's a study that's a little bit further out, but by and large, we have very similar effect estimates from our extracted data to our original, and same with confidence intervals. We can see these black lines, by and large, all fit nice and neatly between -0.5 and 0.5, with a couple of studies that stick up a little, some that stick down a little, a couple of gaps where we have a slightly smaller confidence interval, but by and large, again, very similar. If we want to compare our consistency, down the bottom here is what we were just looking at with our provided data compared to our 4 extractors. But we can also look between extractors, and we see that especially for extractors 1, 2, and 3, we have very similar results. Again, the point estimates are all sitting along 0, and the confidence intervals look nice too. Extractor 4, slightly more variation, but not a great deal. Another way that consistency especially is often measured in these sorts of studies is to look at how often p-values change when you dichotomize at 0.05. And so here I'm looking at the blue boxes show where both extractors are consistent, and in white we have the percentage of times where they were inconsistent, which in this case is 0. And if we look at everywhere across the board, it turns out that there was one study from extractor 4 where the p-value swapped, but in every other case there was agreement. And we know that's not a huge deal because we saw the confidence intervals before and they were quite similar too. It might just mean that it might be useful to use 2 data extractors rather than relying on just one, just in case. In conclusion, we do often have to reanalyze interrupted time series studies when we want to meta-analyze them. And although it can be difficult to obtain original data, with ITS studies, graphs are commonly reported, and so we can use digital data extraction. Even if some of those graphs are a bit dodgy and there may be some errors made in extracting individual data points, the actual level and slope change estimates are accurately obtained. So I think we can use digital data extraction with confidence for interrupted time series studies. Just want to say thanks to my team. And I know that these sessions are quite short, so if you do have a question we don't get up to today, please feel free to email me or zap the QR code. That'll give you my email as well. But I'm happy to answer any questions I've got time for now. Thanks.
I've been told that we don't need to be quite so harsh with question times as well, so I don't need to police everybody quite so much. So please put your, either switch your cameras on and ask, indicate that you want to answer a question, or put it in the chat and I'll introduce you. I had a question about training. How much do you think that training and/or experience is correlated with consistent?
Yeah, well, that was very interesting. We actually we had a little video that I put together for sort of the training and a document, but we actually randomized the order of which the different extractors extracted the data from the studies, so that we could sort of have a look at whether they got better over time or not. And we found that actually they didn't very much. There doesn't seem to be, we haven't done a formal analysis of that, but it seems as though the consistency applied across the board from the first ones to the last ones.
Okay.
And I think it's mainly because the inconsistencies arose generally because of poor graph quality, like the blurred meta-analysis graph that Matt shared before, rather than skill here.
Okay, that's really interesting, I think. And Barbara Mincy's got a question.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much, very interesting. So I'm wondering whether you applied standards for how many data points that you had to have pre and post the interruption in a graph. And I guess where I'm coming from on this is that the epoch standards for at least 3 points pre and 3 points post really seem too generous, I guess I could say, in terms of, kind of in terms of providing a sample size that would be useful for reanalysis.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. And that was something we did use the 3 pre and 3 post, but we definitely had many studies that were actually significantly longer than that. So I've just popped a couple examples up here. And as a matter of fact, here you can see how accurate the data extracting was. So this is a line graph, and the extractor's done a great job here. These are all the points lining up on top of one another. But we had a range. So I think our longest graph was about 150 data points. We did have a couple of those very short ones that were 3 pre and 3 post, but I think the median number was about 24 points. So they did experience a wide range of both numbers of points and different types of graphs too. So from the squiggly line graphs, which was the technical term we came up with, and nice point graphs as well.
Right, but you didn't find that those that were like at 3 or 4 points were less reliable than the longer ones? No, we found actually the biggest factor of reliability was the quality of the image of the graph, and especially the time axis, how well that had been put together, rather than some of the other factors that we thought might affect, but ended up not so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenda. Barbara, I'm just looking to cross my screen. There's no other question, no other people with their hands up that I can see, and no other questions in the chat. I suspect because this involves quite long discussion, if you've got to kind of clarify a point, and maybe you're right, that it might be better to contact outside.
Yeah, I was going to say, feel free to put a question in the chat or just email, that'd be fine too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. And so the next presentation is from my team. It's pre-recorded, and it's Mason Aberoumand in Not Lost in Translation: Standards and Lessons for Individual Patient Data.
Hello,
individual participant data.
My name is Mason Aberoumand.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mason Aberoumand, and I work as a data officer at NHMRC Clinical Trial Center at the University of Sydney. It is my pleasure to present to you today on Not Lost in Translation: Standards and Lessons for Individual Participant Data Processing. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of the land I'm presenting from today. I would also like to acknowledge my co-authors of this project who are listed here. In recent years, the rate of generating data and evidence has skyrocketed, and therefore the need for systematic reviews is on the rise. We know that individual participant data meta-analysis, or the IPD meta-analysis, is the gold standard for combining clinical trial data. However, processing a large number of data sets is not without challenges. Since each data set needs to be carefully coded and cleaned in large scale, there is a chance that errors might be introduced at multiple levels. Despite all that, We realized that clear and consistent guidance on these steps is lacking. In this study, we have aimed to develop a standardized semi-automated approach based on a review of literature, expert opinions, and experience conducting 2 systematic reviews, which I would introduce in the next slide. The first one, ICOM, is a systematic review and IPD network meta-analysis with 131 eligible trials, from which 45 trials have so far provided the data, which accounts for around 7,500 participants. Top Child is a systematic review and nested prospective IPD meta-analysis with 74 eligible trials, which 21 have so far provided the data, which accounts for around 25,000 participants. Please note that we are still expecting to receive more data sets. The data processing starts way before data set has been received. Careful planning is crucial to ensure the quality of output. For each review, we have put together these documents that would make it easy for the trialists and our team to achieve a better level of consistency mixed with higher efficiency in coding and cleaning stages. These documents are suggested coding form, which contains the full list of variable and a brief description of each of the variables and its suggested coding format. Data provision form, which provides more detailed information regarding the trial design and methods. And finally, example dataset which would demonstrate what the optimal final dataset should look like. These documents will be provided to the trialists as a part of the data requesting package. This slide shows example of common errors that was picked up during the cleaning stage. Top left corner points an error in number of twins within each treatment group, which was a result of a typo in the dataset. Top right corner shows the count of a variable was flipped. The error was due to reverse coding. Bottom left corner shows the categorical variable is mistakenly coded in numeric. And top right corner shows an outlier or implausible value with infant ID for variable body temperature. Checking these items for over 130 variables for each dataset is a time-consuming task. That is why we have proposed and designed new semi-automated solutions for coding and cleaning stages of the IPD processing to minimize the checking time and increase the accuracy. In coding stage, a variable map was created. In a variable map, each row represents a study and each column represents a value. Color green marks the availability of that variable and red shows the absence of that variable. Color yellow signifies an issue that needs to be queried or revisited in future. An R script is programmed to read all the individual Excel sheet containing information such as variable availability, trial-specific variable definition, then combine them in a robust HTML file. Example of the variable map is presented on the top right corner of the slide. These are previously done by hand, which made the version control a challenging job, since the information might need to be updated after each round of coding or cleaning. In the cleaning stage, we have utilized R Markdown script, which can print R output in Microsoft Word format. Our R Markdown script checks all the coded variables and generates a report. An example section of this report is presented on the bottom right corner of the slide. This report contains checks for usual areas of error during coding stage, such as data type, missing values, factor levels, dates, and etc. for all the variables. The diagram shows the overall stages of the data processing workflow. In the data coding stage, reviewers map the variables, note queries, reformat, and extract data. This process was later improved by adding the mentioned variable map generating R script. And in the cleaning stage, the mentioned R script, R Markdown script, will be used to produce the mentioned checking report. The resulting report would then be manually compared against publication or registration record when available. Now we can summarize our findings in the following points. Processing large quantity of data is challenging, and there is room for error in multiple areas, which might compromise the evidence generated by systematic reviews. This means there is a need for predefined workflows to guarantee the quality and uniformity of the data. And this will ensure the reliability and reproducibility of the generated evidence. Similar to other areas of research, new technologies and programming techniques can provide tools for reviewers to take advantage of and enables smaller research groups to tackle large systematic review IPD projects. Thank you very much for listening, and please get in touch if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Mason. I'm not going to let him get away with that because he is here in the room, so we can ask him questions live as well. So would anybody like to pose anything? I feel like I can't really because it's my team. Mason, what do you think the best way, what improvements do you think would make the most difference in this situation? What do you think's been the most impactful on creating uniform data sets?
Yeah, hello everyone. I just want to apologize because I somehow didn't put my thank you slides in my email. I just put it in the chat. So if you want to get in touch with me, please do that. So in my opinion, there are guidelines out there, and IPD handbook has some recommendations about what has to be checked for the trials and what checks are necessary. But when you have a large quantity of data sets, because they come from different sources, different languages, and people might have different quality of data management in the centers. So it's very important to basically be able to harmonize and also have the same level of quality for all data sets, because as we know, this is basically trialists send us the data set, they trust in us, we have the responsibility to do the best we can. And this data set would basically, if we do a good job, we might be able to reuse it for further research as well. So
perhaps there is room there for some guidance or kind of help for trialists to understand how best to develop their data so that it's ready for on-sharing.
Yes, it's implementing the guidelines, that is the recommendations in the IPD handbook in a large scale. There is not much workflow to go around with.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mason. I can see no other questions or hands up in the room at the moment. So I think we'll move on to the next talk. Thank you, Mason. Any other questions for Mason, please put in the chat or email him. So Jonathan Williams is going to present live, and he is going to talk about evidence synthesis using individual participant data, strategies for collaboration management. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you, Angela. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay the traditional owners of the land I'm joining you from today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So my name is Jonathan Williams, and I'm part of the Evidence Integration Group at the NHMRC CTC. And our group's interested in evidence synthesis using individual participant data. And in this talk, I'm going to try and give some insights on strategies we use to successfully manage these collaborations. I will just ask you to refrain from any screenshots as we're yet to publish this work. So individual participant data, or IPD meta-analyses, are the gold standard for evidence synthesis. Unlike aggregate data meta-analysis that pull together the average values for multiple trials, IPD meta-analyses obtain the row-by-row information for each participant to calculate the summary values. This leads to improved data quality, flexible analyses, possibility for subgroup analysis, and the opportunity to obtain unpublished data. Compared to aggregate data meta-analyses, however, IPD meta-analyses are more challenging and resource intensive, where projects can often only be performed by forming a collaboration of researchers. Failure to form a strong collaboration could mean availability bias, missing data, or even failure of the project altogether. With the current global need for research collaboration, IPD collaborations present as one of the answers to this problem. Now, to talk you through these strategies, I'll be using two of our largest IPD projects as case studies, which Mason kindly introduced previously. The first is Top Child, which already has 47 datasets pledged with over 40,000 participants. And the second is ICOM, which has already collected data for over 45 trials, totaling over 7,400 participants. And for more information, I direct you to the websites below. With both of these projects, we've built up some pretty amazing teams with a diverse range of skills. Now, before we get into specifics, it is important to state that the team must be sufficiently resourced with skills, time, and funding, but also central management can be extremely helpful. The steering group can be made up of a number of combinations of the above. Some of the roles may be less obvious are language skills to contact international trials, consumer representatives to ensure results have real meaning in the community, and communication skills, which I'll touch on in the next slide. Although in our collaborations, the steering committees perform the majority of the work, the advisory groups play a vital role in providing expertise from different areas and different fields. By onboarding advisors who have big names in their field, you also enhance credibility and leverage of the entire collaboration. And when there's a lack of expertise or position to be filled, we often look within the network of trial representatives that we've already created to fill this position. So to give scope, our team has spent over 450 hours on Top Child communications in the past year alone. And building trust and rapport with collaborators can be difficult, particularly if you've never met them and you restrict yourself to email alone, like has happened during the COVID pandemic. In regard to the graph, with recruitment of trials for Top Child, 40 trials or 85% were happy to join after email alone, though this rarely occurs after just 1 or 2 emails. Where another 7 trials or 15% required combinations of organising Zoom meetings and making phone calls. I would like to highlight, however, that 12 trials or 26% where email was successfully used to recruit trialists, the initial email was actually sent by one of our high-profile advisors, drumming the point that enhanced visibility when promoted by enhanced visibility when you're promoted by these high-profile figures. And it may seem quite obvious, but a friendly, clear, and personalised communication approach has always aided investigators' willingness to be involved in our projects. Finally, we keep an active profile, issuing quarterly newsletters, holding biannual seminars, and providing opportunities for authorship to all representatives. Now, all of that communication may seem quite daunting, and we certainly couldn't do it without the help of a collaboration management tool. We use a database that is comprehensive, but also adaptive to the changing needs of the project. And maybe this record looks a little familiar. So within the system, we also keep meticulous contact logs. And contact logs are essential when managing a large amount of trials, but also help with continuity of contact management between the team members. And continuity is certainly essential when dealing with ethics applications and contracts. Be aware that many countries have far stricter privacy regulations than Australia. And for a meta-analysis, you may be offered an ethics waiver from your institution. But in fact, full ethics approval has actually benefited us in many of these situations. Data transfer agreements are not uncommon requests, but we also actually offer data provision prior to publication agreements. In this agreement, the project agrees to not publish the meta-analysis until the original trial has been accepted for publication. This protects the interests of the collaborator while also maximising data availability and time for data processing before the analysis is performed. Now, ethical and contractual processes can also be assisted by a clear governance plan. This document gives transparency to collaborators on collaboration structure, results, communication strategies, publication. The list goes on, as you can see in front of you. In this plan, we allow flexibility in collaborator input, as trial representatives are often participating on their own time for free. Good governance can also be demonstrated by pilot testing any forms and data packages that you distribute to your trial representatives. So with the global drive for coordinated research efforts, we believe the following strategies will assist IPD collaborations to answer that call. Build yourself a strong, well-resourced team with diverse skills. Engage trial representatives with a dynamic communication strategy. Use a comprehensive and adaptable database with contact logs, be aware of ethical and contractual processes, and have a clear governance plan. And so I'd like to thank all the following people, and I'm happy to take any questions in the time that we have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. You didn't warn me that I was going to spot myself in the middle of that presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Jonathan? Please put your hands up and I'll get to you. I was reflecting the other day, Jonathan and team, about like you're always trying to find silver linings for a pandemic situation, but I was reflecting that in general, my observation, N of 1, is that the communication literacy of a wider group of people has increased because we've all been so reliant on video communications and not face-to-face interactions. And I wondered if you had any reflections on how that's played out as you've developed Top Child, which started around the same time as the pandemic kicked off, and whether you've noticed anything or any proliferation of platforms or any difficulties in engaging like that.
Look, I don't think, I think that one advantage of having a lot of online seminars has been really advantageous to such a global collaboration, because people don't have to come to a conference or things like that. Although you miss the face-to-face interaction, I think we've been able to connect with a lot of people that couldn't necessarily make it a face-to-face meeting.
Sure. Sure. I mean, my personal observation from being a clinician is that I think, and a lot of trialists are clinicians too, is that it's actually very difficult sometimes from a hospital setting to access some platforms because of firewalls. And so for us in the hospital, the pandemic's been great because it's forced the health district to allow us to access video conferencing, whereas before it was very restrictive. So we still can't use Zoom in the hospital network, but we can use Teams and we can use other things. So the ability and the functionality of us in our roles at work has become more connected. So that's been helpful. I saw that Matthew had his hands up. Have you got a question, Matthew?
Yep. Great presentation, Jonathan. That figure of 450 hours time, do you consider that representative of an IPD meta-analysis, or is it something special about the one you're doing? And does it get quicker over time at all? It's just
yeah, so I think Top Child is a very difficult IPD meta-analysis because there's also a deconstruction of interventions that's going on as well. And I'd encourage everyone to have a look up the website if you want to learn more about it. But I would say it's not a standard meta-analysis because it is quite large. But this is also one of the questions we're trying to answer within our team. So you will see something in that space when we have some answers and some guidelines as to like what's involved. So
yeah, I mean, I haven't even estimated the person time for a standard review, so I don't really know what to compare it to. But 450 sounds like a lot.
Yeah, I've split over a bunch of people over the course of a year. It adds up. A few hours of emailing every day. You distribute some data packages to people, making those data packages. Yeah, all of that does add up slowly. So.
It does add up. I think our person time's often difficult to convey. I constantly have people saying, how long does it take to do a systematic review, or how long does it take to do an IPD? It's like, well, really, you've got to look at it's project specific up to a point, but there are some commonalities. Thanks for those questions. Any more in the chat? I think we will move on because we're running short of time. We've got Lene Seidler going to present next on the emergence of clinical trials addressing COVID-19 in Australia. Thank you, Lene.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for the great talks before. Really, I'll change tact a little bit, but I will actually come back to some of the data sharing themes later on, focusing a bit more on that than on the results of this study actually, because this has been published, so you are able to access it as well and read in more depth. So I will present on lessons from an analysis of the landscape of early COVID-19 trials in Australia, and would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aberoumand Nation. And I will start with a spoiler. So these were the headlines following the release of our analysis of early COVID-19 trials in Australia, talking about a massive research waste. And in this talk, I will quickly summarize the main results of the study and its implications for evidence synthesis, but also with a focus on what would need to change in future to not repeat such a headline. The aim of our study was to develop an understanding of the early trials addressing the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, and to what extent Australian researchers followed and responded to the global need for coordination and collaboration. what we did is we systematically searched clinical trial registries, the ANZ-CTR and clinicaltrials.gov, up to November 2020. So I'd just like to emphasize these are early trials in the pandemic. We included all interventional trials recruiting in Australia and looked at a number of outcomes, including whether the trials collected core outcome sets. We used an early outcome set by Alison et al., which you can see here to do that. And this is a snapshot of what we found. I don't have time today to go into these findings in depth. You can read about it in our publication, but maybe just to highlight, first of all, the low number of trials, including the most vulnerable populations. On the right-hand side, you can see only 7 of the trials included participants with comorbidities, and also the low number of trials using adaptive design. So only 2 of the trials used these innovative methods. But now let me jump straight into the interpretation of our findings. So first of all, we found a commendable, impressive, and rapid research scale, which is great. However, some of this rapid scale up likely came at the cost of scientific rigor and strategic prioritization of research topics. So most of the studies, 90%, focused on drug and devices, and there were no trials on community transmission or public health messaging, which is a major gap. There were also arguably too many trials on 6 in Australia line, randomizing participants to hydroxychloroquine. This was a politically popular, but later shown to be harmful treatment. We also found, as already mentioned, a lack of innovative design features to increase the speed and efficiency of trials. And one major problem with the studies was a small planned sample size. So thousands of the participants would be required to detect moderate differences in mortality for COVID-19 treatment. However, the median sample size we found was 150. And now all of you in the room are familiar with systematic reviews, and you might think, well, we can just combine them to generate sufficient power. Yet, as you can see in the figure down on the left-hand side, most of these trials didn't actually even collect the core outcomes. And this is just reduced to the treatment trials, this analysis. We can see in green, the trials that collected the core outcomes, and in red, the ones that did not. And even for mortality, shown right at the bottom, only half of the treatment trials even collected the outcome of mortality. And this makes meaningful evidence synthesis impossible and constitutes research waste. Now, related to that, only 80% of trials plan to share their data, which I think ties in well with the previous talks we've heard today. And I will actually go into a little bit more detail here and have an excursus, because this is really in stark contrast to high-profile calls for data sharing that happened throughout the pandemic. And most recently, here by Lawrence et al., talking about the lessons of ivermectin, where they go as far as to say that any meta-analysis on COVID-19 should request and personally review IPD, even if they're doing aggregate data meta-analyses. So a stark contrast to the only 20% of investigators saying that they intend to share their data. And I think it's important to mention that it is insufficient to blame the individual researchers for this. So in this other analysis we recently published, we looked at barriers to data sharing and found that low data sharing intentions are structural, cultural, and financial problems. So stakeholders on many different levels need to work together to address the problem of low data sharing. And I think this is a nice point that also applies to the other limitations we found of COVID-19 research, that in order to address these problems in research, we need change on a systemic structural level. So let me go back to the conclusion about research on COVID-19 in Australia. We found that whilst research scale-up has been impressive, research design has not been sufficiently strategic or collaborative, which has led to the potential for taxpayer-funded research waste. And the coordinated efforts are required to address COVID-19, such as large adaptive trials, prospective meta-analyses, or other collaborative approaches. And I would like to end on a positive note that examples for such coordinated approaches do exist, and I would like to argue that we can see them increasingly as the pandemic evolves. So this is a large perspective meta-analysis here on the left-hand side, which changed practice globally. And on the right-hand side, the recovery adaptive trial, which has recruited over 40,000 participants to date and led to many practice-changing findings. We're currently updating our analyses and are hoping to see a lot more positive results in our next publication on this. But for now, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors and also the AIMS at CTR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. That's a great presentation. Any questions from anybody in the audience? Please raise your hands or switch your camera on. Oh, Matthew.
Great presentation, Lena. You're pointing out at the end the recovery trial. I think I've heard some people in Australia say, unfortunately, we could never do something like that here because of the bureaucracy and the ethics application system in Australia. Do you have anything to say to that? Do you think that's just too pessimistic? Do you think we could have done something like that in Australia?
Look, I think saying we could have never done anything like this or we could never do it in future is definitely too pessimistic. But I definitely agree that Australia was in a challenging position for many reasons. First of all, we luckily just didn't have the number of COVID-19 patients. So many of the trials that were planned actually then later on had to withdraw or recruit only very few participants. But I think even that really shows the importance of global coordination and collaboration. And something I haven't shown just then is that most of these trials were actually national only trials. They weren't multinational, no, they weren't connected around the world. And that was a big limitation. But yeah, I think that's also why I pulled up a slide about the different stakeholders that need to be involved. I don't think this is something an individual researcher can solve on their own. I think we need to think structurally. I think we need to think about our ethics processes, about our funding processes, and how in future this can all work a lot more smoothly to enable such important research.
Thank you, Lena. I mean, I can certainly speak to that a little bit. I'm very excited to see what the reanalysis of this project shows, because from a clinical perspective, my hospital where I work is Westmead, which was the centre of the Delta outbreak in Sydney. And with a bit of lead time, this second wave of the pandemic with the Delta virus, the clinical services were so much more highly organised because they'd learnt lessons and watched overseas. And there was no trial. There was no person admitted to any of the COVID wards that was not considered for a trial. We had something like 5 or 6 trials going simultaneously, and almost every person was in at least one trial, which I think is great medical practice, actually. So there was lots of trials going on, treatment trials, but that's just in a hospital. That's not the prevention. That's not the public health messaging. I still think, as usual, we may see that public health messaging and community prevention trials will be underserved. That will be my prior. But I'm looking forward to seeing what we can show when we look at the second year of the pandemic and what that's brought to trial landscape in Australia. Any other questions from anybody else? We are 3 minutes over time, but I think that's pretty good altogether. I'd like to thank you very much for coming and sharing this session, and thank you to all of the presenters and all of the audience. So thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Angela.